start in just about, I'd say, 1 more minute in case there's any that are related.
Wow. There's the artillery.
We made it to Antietam. Do this all for you. Because I love you and I wanted you to be happy here. But then the orders I give after this.
Yeah. I know.
Parker, what is that down there?
That clock thing.
No, yeah, see that tower?
Yeah. I forget. There's the cannons.
Yeah, you love those cannons.
Yeah. Because I like the way they're positioned.
This is Antietam Creek is east.
Yeah. It's not far from me.
I think we passed
We
the sign.
passed Antietam Creek.
Get your way.
No, scoot back down that way, Alex. All the way to the end, so you couldn't move.
Alrighty, so welcome. This is the second of our 3-time-a-day battlefield talk. So roughly what this is just a general conversation about what happened here on September 17th of the year 1862. Surprise, surprise, there was a battle. No one would ever know. Specifically, it was the deadliest day in American history where over 22,000 people became casualties of war. And a casualty, just because it's going to be thrown around a lot in this talk, is either dead, wounded, or missing. And for the missing part, it's unfortunately just, for the most part, means that you were dead, but no one could identify you. So just some general quick things about the significance of the Battle of Antietam. There are 3 things. Firstly, it's known as the deadliest day in American history, like I mentioned before. Additionally, it was a strategic turning point in the war, as it was Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, one of the biggest fighting forces that the Confederacy had to offer. This is his first real invasion of the North, specifically of Maryland, because Maryland was a very important border state, because it separated the states of Pennsylvania, which is a very strong Union territory, and that of Virginia. Thirdly, it allowed President Abraham Lincoln, who had previously in the summer of 1862 drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. The Battle of Antietam served as a way that he can justify this, because the Emancipation Proclamation, as a surprise, was very controversial at that time. So it really kind of changed the soon-to-be norms of how America operated during the war and after the war, in the sense that it allowed people that were enslaved in the South and rebelling territories, but not border states like that in Maryland, and allowed these people to be free. And therefore, it allowed them to join things like the United States Colored Troops, which would, in theory, be able to allow the Union to replace a lot of its losses by having tens to hundreds of thousands of these people join the ranks of the Union Army. So there's 2 main figures I really want to talk about really quickly for the Battle of Antietam. Firstly is General McClellan of the Union Army. He leads the Army of the Potomac, which is one of the largest fighting forces the Union Army had to offer at the time. And then you have Robert E. Lee, who also, as many people know, led the Army of Northern Virginia, one of the largest fighting forces the Confederacy, again, had to offer. And both of these guys, they know what they're doing for the most part. They've been in the Army, the U.S. Army, before the war. McClellan was a leading officer who set an expedition to Crimea during the Crimean War in Russia to observe how military fortifications were implemented and also how to effectively defend, which is really important in 1862 for him. And then you have Robert E. Lee, who was a colonel in the Virginian Army and the Virginia militia before the war, and he obviously joined the Confederacy. We know that now. And so one important thing I'm going to say a lot is corps. And a corps is, at least for reference, is a military formation of several regiments. And these regiments can be from different states, but they're all fighting in the same corps. So this is tens of thousands of people when I'm mentioning a corps in this talk. So, just some strategic context before the Battle of Antietam. Lee's main goal for invading the North was shifting the fight from a defensive posture to an offensive posture. Specifically, throughout 1862, Robert E. Lee was defending the capital, the Confederacy, in Richmond, Virginia, from attacks from McClellan's forces, where McClellan was actually very, very close to taking Richmond. In fact, he was actually on the outskirts of it. But unfortunately for him, he was not able to take the capital, which now meant that it's Lee's turn, this time to try and take Washington, D.C. Additionally, he also wanted to scare the crap out of the Union guys, and that's because the midterm elections are coming up. Specifically, if that meant that if Lincoln was out of the picture, then therefore maybe a new presidential candidate can become the picture, and in turn possibly be a little bit more reconciliatory with the Confederacy, specifically by allowing them to be recognized as its own country, which the South really wanted to do, and try and get nations like Ireland, England, France, all these countries that are buying cotton and wool from the South, because that's the major sense of money for the Confederacy through export, because that's really what the South was doing before the war as a major agricultural territory in the U.S. And they lacked infrastructure like the North, and you really only see big cities, only a couple places that are in ports. So Savannah, New Orleans, and then also in Richmond, which is really, really, really important for the Confederacy. So if those three things all happened, then that would mean that it'd have to be a very important victory for the South. And so they really pitched all their money towards the Battle of Sharpsburg, or Antietam. In their minds, it's Sharpsburg. So, additionally, one major reason for Lee being in the North to begin with is because of supplies. For the most part, all the Confederacy supplies are coming out of Richmond. And if you're on the move, that's pretty far. And Richmond's fairly far from here. It's roughly, if you're marching with a lot of men, it's roughly a month. And that's where a lot of Confederates actually came from. And they saw Maryland essentially as the breadbasket of the Union in a way, because it was relatively untouched by the war at this point. All the fighting, for the most part, either been down south, out west, or in Virginia. So Maryland was essentially plentiful. You can get food here, you can get supplies, you can get fresh water, you can take your time to rest and bathe, which a lot of these Confederates that are soon to be attacking the town of Sharpsburg, they don't have the opportunity to. There's a very interesting account of a woman from Frederick, Maryland, just a couple days before the battle, of when Texan troops came marching into the town in order to go fight here along Antietam Creek. And what she was saying, you could smell the Confederates before you could see them, because these guys have quite literally marched all the way from Richmond without stopping. So there's accounts of guys falling to the side of formation when they're not really supposed to be to, because they don't have a shoe. You have a left shoe but not have a right shoe, because the right shoe wore down a little bit because you're dragging it too much on the cobblestones of Frederick. Additionally, these guys have tatters on their bodies. And that's quite literally because, again, these guys march all the way from Richmond without stopping. They don't have the exact same supply infrastructure as the Union does. Because, fun fact, the Confederacy had supply problems. But the Union also did. But for the Union, you had Harrisburg up north. You got, at the time, or before the Confederates got there, you got Frederick, and you got Washington, D.C., most importantly. Since the main goal of the Confederacy at this point was to go take D.C., and Sharpsburg was an important junction in the pathway to get there. So, the Union situation right before the Battle of Antietam, there's a bunch of major setbacks in Eastern theater, and Lincoln, most importantly, needed a morale boost. Since from 1861 to 1862, the Union's not having that much of a fun time. You have important battles like first Bull Run, and then also Second Bull Run, both not the greatest victories, I would say. In fact, they're both losses. And most importantly for this, Lincoln needs to convince his own troops that they can effectively fight. Because if you're showing them that they're able to win a fight, you might have guys that want to enlist, or guys not desert, or most importantly, guys renewing their contracts with the Army. Since 1861, a lot of these regiments, they have 3-month and 6-month and maybe a year-long contracts. And September is right around that period where these guys, they're getting out, or you have new guys coming in. A lot of these new guys, they don't have experience. And especially at Second Bull Run, and then even the Battle of Harper's Ferry, which only occurred a couple days before the Battle of Antietam, all these guys, they're either deserting or they're getting captured. And in fact, over 12,000 Union troops got captured, the Battle of Harper's Ferry, which only happened 2 to 3 days before the Battle of Antietam. This was really important for the Confederacy because they captured one of the largest arsenals in this area that the Federal Army held, to the point that these Confederates that previously were marching away from Richmond, they can now effectively resupply, especially Confederate troops under A.P. Hill, which would be very, very important in the latter parts of the Battle of Antietam, which I'll obviously get to. But most importantly for the Union, right before the Battle of Antietam, you had the Battle of South Mountain, just south of here. And it was really important because it was a victory. It wasn't an outstanding victory. It was more of a, I want to say a skirmish, but a small battle where only a couple thousand people were engaged, and thankfully, not many people lost their lives. But most importantly, it humbled Robert E. Lee. It meant that he can't go in guns blazing in Maryland and expect everything to come to him. He has to fight for it, which makes his rationale and his decision making at the Battle of Antietam be a little bit more understandable, I would say. So Lee's positioning right before the Battle of Antietam was really based on the geography, because you can't just move a mountain, you can't move a hill, and you can't just magically move a river a couple hundred feet to your left so you can effectively cross it. So what he decided to do is he wanted to have his flank kind of mirror the eastern part of Antietam Creek, in the sense because for the most part in the Civil War, the South always had, at least for the most part, this is not every time, but they usually had less troops than the Union, in the sense that, generally speaking, their troops, unless they're not fresh conscripts from, let's say, the VMI, these guys have been in the capital battles beforehand. Maybe they're in the militia before the war, or they fought at First and Second Bull Run, and this is their third major battle. But generally speaking, for the Union, a lot of the regiments here, these guys enlisted only 3 to 4 weeks before the battle. So it's these guys' baptism of fire, which happens to, unfortunately of them, be the deadliest day in American history. So, generally speaking, the Confederate lines, they're shadowing the environment, they're shadowing stuff already there. You have Confederates behind Dunkard Church, and east of it, you have Confederate General Jackson, on the far left, and then Longstreet in the center. These guys are playing with the terrain, which unfortunately would, at least for the Union guys, be not in their favor as they're attacking, so they have to go against the geography. And so generally speaking, on the eve of the battle, over 87,000 Union troops converge on the town of Sharpsburg, generally speaking, shadowing the entire northern area. And unfortunately for McClellan, or fortunately for him, he only needs to commit 67,000 of these guys. So only 67 of these guys are going to be in, I would say, a general not so nice positioning they have to attack from. But then for the Confederates, they have over 45,000 troops. And all of these guys, they're getting committed. Because Lee can't effectively shadow his flanks. And that's because his ranks, generally speaking, they're going to be more stretched out than the Union ones. That's because he can't, as I said before, cover his flanks, which is going to haunt him later in the day. But on the 15th and 16th of December, Lee organized his army behind him in Antietam Creek, and McClellan arrives in the town. And his plan is to launch a simultaneous flank attack, in which General Hooker is going to attack from the north, General Porter in the center, and then Burnside in the south, which is where you get the name of Burnside's Bridge. But on the 16th of September, in the evening and going into the early morning of September 17th, there's a skirmish involving Hooker's First Corps, in which it probes the Confederate left, generally speaking near the eastern woods in that area. And he unfortunately meets General Hood's division of the Confederacy, and they engage in a skirmish at twilight. Not too many people die here, but if you look at a lot of letters in the Battle of Antietam, they're being written the night before, in which they hear fighting going on in these woods, and they're ready, or they think they're ready, to have this giant battle in which these two great armies meet on this generally untouched landscape before you guys. But on 5:30 in the morning, on September the 17th, General Hooker attacks Jackson's left flank in the north near the Millis cornfield and the east woods, and then over 8,000 people lose their lives in only the first 4 hours. And that's generally speaking right around there where the cornfield is on the outskirts of the Dunkard Church. And then also going on at this time in the Miller's cornfield, Union troops advanced through the fire and through the morning fog, to the cornfield until they are almost immediately hit by Confederate artillery and rifle fire. And for the Confederates, they kind of knew what was going for them in a sense. They can effectively place their artillery pieces. A lot of the deaths that are caused here are caused by artillery. And then General Hooker described this engagement and the fire radiating from the cornfield as if, quote, every stalk of corn was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife, and that multiple assaults and counterattacks left bodies, quote, in rows as they had stood. And then going on, the Dunker Church is right over there, if you guys can kind of see the sequel of it. Mansfield's 12th Corps joins Hooker's 1st Corps and moves to the area east of the Miller's Farmstead, where he joins Mansfield's rookie soldiers who had only been in the service for about 3 to 4 weeks before the battle even happened, with some even enlisting in August of 1862. So these guys haven't really been in for a month and they're already seeing all this fighting. They're immediately slaughtered by Confederate artillery. And then in fact, General Mansfield, who had retreated to the rear in order to reorganize his army and bring in new soldiers, he unfortunately got struck down by Confederate fire and died the next day in the town of Shaftesbury at a military hospital, which for the most part would be some random person's house. It's covered from the fire, it's covered from the rain, from the elements, and it's perfect space for a hospital. But then Union troops of the 1st Corps come very close to breaking the Confederate lines near Dunker Church, just up until Confederate Generals Hood and Law arrived, just in the nick of time for the Confederates, at the expense of 60% of the regiment falling victims of fire. 60%. This is only in a couple hours, and these guys weren't even supposed to be there in the first place. This is actually a photograph of Confederates along the turnpike, which essentially is the road that you're taking down to go towards the Dunker Church. You can imagine as roads as they had stood, these guys up along that fence, and they're defending it. I believe, I do not quote me on this, but I believe that they are Georgians. But then, in the Westwoods, which is an often forgotten part of the battle, which is very, very, very important, Robert E. Lee telegrams E.P. Hill, and he tells them, I can't effectively cover my flanks. There's tens of thousands more Federal soldiers here, and I can't cover especially my eastern flank, where I only have 500 Georgians protecting Burnside's bridge. I need you here, now. And mind you, he had just taken Harper's Ferry only about 2 or 3 days beforehand. So his troops are there, and they're hanging out, they're resting a little bit, but now they gotta hike all the way over here. So these guys have to march dozens of miles. I believe it is about 17 miles that these guys have to force march. The same day that the Battle of Antietam's going on, and they gotta get their butts over here and help them out. But then not long past 7 o'clock in the morning, Sumner attempts to relieve the remnants of Mansfield's forces who don't have their commanding officer anymore because the guy's pretty much dying. They attempt to send the 2nd Corps to flank Confederate General Ambrose Burnside's men by fording the Antietam River. But a lot of these Federal soldiers find out that the Antietam River is a little bit too deep. You can't just walk across it or swim through it. It's too deep. So the only place they can really cross is at Burnside's bridge. And they send scouting parties up and down the river to try and find a crossing point, but they can't find any. But then around 9 a.m., Sumner personally leads the attack with Sedgwick's division, unfortunately without full reconnaissance, which is the one thing you want to do if you're in unfamiliar terrain. And speaking of the terrain does not favor the Federal soldiers at all. These guys have to go through all of these deep trees and cross an open field, and they're almost immediately hit by Confederate fire. Unfortunately for Sedgwick's forces, a Federal soldier or a Federal officer with the last name of French, who's not French, I looked it up, he becomes attached and he decides to attack the center of the battlefield. For some reason, I've looked on the map and I'm like, there's nothing going on over there, man. So Sedgwick pretty much gets caught by himself and he gets flanked on the front, left, and the right flanks by Confederate artillery and rifle fire. So those guys do not have a fun time. And essentially after that, any attempt to take the north is not going to happen until later on. And over 2,200 casualties occur within 30 minutes. It was that bad. So later on, at around 9:30 to 1 o'clock in the afternoon, There's stuff going on at Blay Lane. Specifically, the remaining elements of Sumner's division, including the very famous Irish Brigade, attempt to try and take a sunken farm transportation lane, which had been used by Confederate troops under D.H. Hill as a sort of defensive trench line, in the sense that if I hold this position, it pretty much is invulnerable to anything unless it's a flanking attack. And that the Irish Brigade's courageous frontal assault of the trench line, unfortunately for them, fell like a grain before the scythe. There's a lot of analogies about farming, because it used to be a farming land before the war, and it was even still doing it during the war and after the war, and even until now. And that even though the Confederates were initially victorious in holding this territory, gaps happen in their flanks because they don't have that many reinforcements, because they don't have them. On the far right flank, you have New Yorkers that are successful in taking a little pocket of the trench line, and then from there they exploit it by flooding into the lane, shooting down through it at these Confederates, and also getting behind it, threatening to cut them off. This is actually a photograph of the aftermath of it to help you get a better visual. So in the line, in the trench line, those are Confederates. Staying right there, those are Union soldiers. This is roughly 2 days after the battle happened, when Gardner took his famous photos. And you can only imagine what it's like to be in there, because you have no real escape route. You can't go forward because there's federal soldiers there. You can't go behind because they're also there. You can't go crossing through it because they're also there. So, but for the Confederates, they managed to regroup and retreat a little bit south towards the Piper Farm, where there's even more furious fighting going on, but it's often forgotten about. But it's very, very, very important, because it's the scene of another Union general falling victim to the fire, because a lot of these guys, they have to lead from the front, because the battle is so jam-packed with tens of thousands of guys being there at the exact same time, with cannon fire and rifle fire causing you to not be able to see, which is why icons like the trench line and then like the Dunkirk Church being very important, because it stands out and it's a focus point that the artillery can pinpoint on. So they can know, oh, I'm east of the Dunkirk Church, don't shoot me. There you go. But then after this attack, both sides stagger. There's lots of engagement going on at the Piper Farm. But the Union General Richardson, who was leading this, at the time, successful attack, he unfortunately fell victim to fire and died. And after that, there's not too much going on in other parts of the battlefield, until you get to Burnside's Bridge. And this is after over 5,000 troops on both sides fell during fighting for the trench line. So between the hours of 1 o'clock and 3:30 p.m., there's a lot of engagements going on at the Burnside's Bridge. You'd think, oh, it's got to be tens of thousands of guys shooting at each other. No, it's only 500 Georgians who are attempting to hold off Burnside's 4th Corps. And these Confederates, they're dug in. They have the terrain advantage in the sense that they're on top of the hill shooting down at a small, narrow bridge where over 10,000 Union troops are gathered on the other side. Specifically, they're behind a stone wall. They have a decent amount of cover, but then the bridge is completely open. It's pretty much a slaughter. And this is also another good visual on that. So the Union troops would have been down on the bottom part of this, where the stone wall is. The Confederates, under General Toombs, would have been way up here, shooting down.
No way out.
And over several hours, starting around 10 o'clock in the morning, the Union troops were trying to take this bridge. And that's when they start trying to find other ways to ford the Antietam River. But they just can't, because again, it's too deep. So this is their only opportunity. But thankful for the Union, they have the opportunity, which is messed up as it sounds, to keep throwing soldiers at a problem until it resolves itself, which they managed to do up until Colonel Edward Ferraro, an Italian who lived in Spain, who immigrated to the U.S., who also happened to be an expert on dancing, who also famously wrote a book called The History of Dancing before the war, and then even had a part 2 of it after the war, and then later went on to dance more professionally in New York City after the war. He managed to cross the bridge, and I always like to say he was dancing across it. That did not happen. That's why. But then afterwards, the Union troops, they start to converge to the town of Sharpsburg, which is very important for the Confederates to hold, because it's their main access point to the town of Shepherdstown, now in West Virginia, because that's the one way that Robert E. Lee, in case his plan goes south, he can go south and save his skin, which he had to hold at any means necessary. And that pretty much relies on the Confederates, specifically under E.P. Hill, coming in from Harper's Ferry to arrive just in time to save that right flank before it falls, which E.P. Hill manages to do. He managed to hold off all of Burnside's advance until the following day, when the battle pretty much dies down. And during this engagement, tens of thousands of guys are still falling, to the point that both sides not effectively able to wage war on each other, just because either half your regiments or over half your regiments pretty much a casualty, so they can't fight. You know, you lost your officer, because then you can't effectively have your guy as a lead. There's all these junior officers that have to coordinate with each other, and instead of being told, go somewhere, and they can effectively do that. Or you just can't move. That's because of trains. You don't want to cross an open field like that when you got Confederate artillery pointing right at you. So the battle pretty much winds down on the end of the day on the 17th, and nothing really happens on the 18th besides Confederates starting to retreat through the 19th down to Shepherdstown. There is actually a small battle afterwards in which they're able to hold back McClellan's troops and therefore live on to fight another day, going to hunt the Union, the Battle of Gettysburg only a couple months later in 1863. So, at the end of the day, on the 17th, 22,717 people become casualties. Specifically for the Union, 2,108 are killed, 9,540 are wounded, and 753 are missing. Like I said earlier, missing does not mean I can't find you. That means you're most likely dead and I can't identify you. Because dog tags and stuff like that, they don't exist yet. If you're lucky, maybe you have a pendant with your name on it, or you have a letter that's addressed to you, or maybe a photo, something like that. Little things that these people that are burying you can identify you. But for the Confederates, a lot of them are just in mass graves after the battle, just because that's just the way the war was. And you know, Maryland at this point was federal territory, so I'm not going to bother to identify you. But a couple years after the war, a lot of these states, they reinterred their dead back down in their home territories. That's why if you go to the National Cemetery afterwards, there's no Confederate buried there because they're buried elsewhere. But for the Confederates, 1,546 were killed, 7,752 were wounded, and 1,018 are missing. And so generally, the broader impacts of the Battle of Antietam can be felt in two main ways. Like I said earlier, McClellan is able to hold Maryland and not let it fall to the Confederates. He's able to protect D.C. and guarantee that Lincoln has a decent victory under his belt, which means that he can go through the midterm elections pretty much without any other issues. But most importantly, the Emancipation Proclamation now has force behind it, in the sense that he has a reason and a good victory again under his belt to implement it, which means that after this victory and after the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect on New Year's Day in 1863, you can get tens of thousands of new soldiers who are fairly well motivated to fight to join the Union Army and to reinforce its ranks, which comes into use especially in 1863 when the United States Army implements the draft, which does not go that well for them in the sense that there's rioting in lots of places, which requires the United States colored troops to fill in those ranks and fight in battles, especially in the deep South, South Carolina, North Carolina, and they would even be present at the signing of the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia in April 1865 in Appomattox, Virginia. So, generally speaking, the Battle of Antietam was the deadliest day in American history. However, it was a very important day, especially during the Civil War, as it taught both sides how to effectively wage war. You can see, like, the big fields, it almost reminds you a little bit of Gettysburg if you've been there.
Mm-hmm.
Helps you fight the terrain. You know, you have the sunken road down there, remnants of, you know, the Battle of Petersburg in 1864. In a sense, that's trench warfare, which later would go on, especially, you know, in World War I and all that. And then you also have, you know, Burnside's Bridge being important to making sure you you know, where you can effectively cross the river. But you see a lot of things like pontoon bridges show up for the first time. So the Army Corps of Engineers, they have a field day with this battle afterwards, in the sense that it's a really good studying point in order to how wage war. And most importantly, it set the tone for the rest of the American Civil War, which you can see a lot of bloody fighting. Fortunately, you know, it's not going to be all be in one day like this, but it's going to be spread out, but making the war, generally speaking, more miserable if you fight it. But now it's a beautiful national park, you know, great 10-stop self-driving tour if you haven't done that already. It also makes for a good film, which should be going on in the next hour and actually starting soon if you guys want to catch that if you haven't already. But thanks for listening. If you guys have any other questions, I'll be up here for a little bit. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay cool. Thank you.
Wow.
I'm not gonna be here too much